Thank you very much. Mr. Hundt.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member Camp. I'm here as the CEO of the Coalition for Green Capital. On a personal note, I'd like to recognize the importance of Michigan on both the Republican and Democratic side. I was born in Ann Arbor, and I will be going back there with my wife for the graduation of our son from the Ross School of Business in 2 weeks, assuming that the President squeezes us in along with the rest of the crowd. I met many of the members of your committee a decade and a half ago, when I was the chairman of the Federal Communications Commission. And I mention that because, not at all exclusively because of federal regulation, but significantly because of the 1996 Telecom Act, a bipartisan measure that, of course, started in the House and eventually got through the Senate. Because of that, American entrepreneurs, private equity investors, investors from all over the world spent about $1 trillion building anew America's communications network. Everything that we know today, whether we're Twittering or BlackBerrying or making a cell phone call, is almost always on a network that was built sometime between 1995 and today. And that tremendous, colossal private sector investment created about 1/5 of all of the jobs created in the 1990s, the 20 million net new jobs that made the 1990s the best decade in our lifetime for American workers. It's that same rebuilding of our buildings in America so that they're energy efficient, and our electricity network so that it is founded on a clean basis and a renewable basis instead of a carbon emissions intensive basis. It's that same rebuilding in both respects, in the way we use energy and in the way we produce it, that will do two things. It will create, again, anew about 5 million new jobs, and it also will lead to absolute national security and world leadership in the effort to have a clean economy. In very, very broad terms, if we invest about $250 billion, private sector investment, in replacing existing building materials with energy efficient building materials, and about $250 billion, the same number, in replacing our carbon emissions intensive generation with the less carbon emissions intensive generation, those two numbers added together, the $500 billion, should produce about 5 million new jobs and should give us a reduction of about 1/3 of the total CO2 emissions per year in the United States. That would take us into world leadership in terms of having a clean economy and in terms of carbon abatement. Right now, we are 11th in the world in the percentage of our GDP that we invest in the change to a clean economy. And we're dropping, and China is getting farther and farther ahead. There are three problems, but first I'm going to tell you, if you'll permit me, the conclusion. I just want to urge two things of the many good things that could be mentioned. I want to urge that this committee give serious support to extending Section 1603, the grant in lieu of the ITC, for as long as you can see a way to do it. And second, I urge this committee support, as the members have already done in the past, the creation of a green bank, such as introduced by Congressman Van Hollen in March of 2009 in the Green Bank Act. And as Congressman Van Hollen, who I have the pleasure of voting for every 2 years, as Congressman Van Hollen knows, that provision was passed in the Energy and Commerce Committee 51-6. 51-6. It is a truly bipartisan measure. Those are the two suggestions I'm going to make, and I'd like to confine my remarks to describing the problem that I think that those two measures would go a long way to solving. It's a three-part problem. Problem number one, because of the tremendous drop in the total output of the economy, starting with the events of 2008, we now have in the United States little or no natural market-driven new demand for electricity. There are a few states that are exceptions, but in most states we have more potential output than we have demand. because our total overall consumer demand and business demand has dropped so far, so fast. Therefore, if we depend on the market to demand new forms of electricity, we have to wait 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 years before that demand will materialize. Lucky China has the fastest growing demand market in the world, and anybody can sell almost anything in that market. But in the United States, we have to find a way to replace, not wait for new demand. Number two, electricity. Of all the identical goods and services in our economy, none varies more in price state by state than electricity. It varies by as much as 4 times. The price in Kentucky, where Congressman Yarmouth is, versus Connecticut is almost a 4 times difference. That's because, unlike beer and soap and telephone service, you can't send it over a distance without a great expense, and also, unlike many goods, you can't really store it. So consequently, it needs to be made locally and it's consumed locally, which is why the prices vary so much on a state-by-state basis. And the sad paradox is this: where emissions are high and unemployment is high, the two places you'd love to see jobs and see the emissions taken out, typically that's where electricity is low priced. Michigan, Ohio, Kentucky, Illinois, in these states. So somehow we have to find a way to create incentives for firms to put in emissions reduction technologies, for businesses to invest in that, and create jobs precisely where electricity prices are low. And one thing we cannot do, I think, as a practical matter, is say to the people in Michigan at this particular point in their history, we know you're paying 9 cents a kilowatt hour. Why don't you pay 14 cents as a base the way they do in California? Why don't you pay 17 cents as they do in Connecticut? Why don't you pay 24 cents the way that they're doing in Hawaii? I would suggest to you that that wouldn't be a bipartisan measure. So somehow we have to address these problems on a local, state-by-state basis. And the third and last problem is this: it's just a fact that to have carbon capture for coal facilities or combined cycle natural gas or solar or wind, today the unit economic costs are higher than if you were to build a coal generation facility. They will come down when firms like Dow continue to have scale and continue to innovate. But today, it's higher. So somehow we have to lower the price of clean electricity and create a way for people to invest in those particular products and bring them into the market without saying to the consumer, you have to lose, and without saying to the shareholders of utilities, you have to lose. We don't want the consumer to lose, we want the consumer to win, and we don't want the utilities to be punished because we want them to invest in this new activity. And that gets me to the conclusion, which is, as Congressman Van Hollen outlined in his Green Bank Act, if we create an institution that for 20 years, that was the chartered time in that act, that for 20 years would provide low-cost, long-term financing, and if we make a commitment through tax policy, particularly the Section 1603 grant, then those two concepts put together mean that it is possible for new investment in clean electricity generation and new financing investment in replacing building materials with new efficient product. We can have those investments take place so that profit can be made and the consumers can be protected. Thank you very much.